Welcome to Axis and ARC, brought to you by the May Institute for Strategic Studies, an entirely youth-led think tank. We trace the lines of conflict, culture, and cooperation, and connect the people driving what's next.
Today's episode, we are delving into a recent research paper produced by the Institute titled The Indigenisation of Drone Warfare in Africa. I'm Genevieve Labuschagne. I am a research director at the Institute, and I am joined today by a researcher and writer who was integral to the research report produced, Anya Melnyk.
Hi, Genevieve. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. Very excited to dive into this conversation. So, in our report, The Indigenisation of Drone Warfare in Africa, the central argument is that modern drone warfare is no longer primarily about who owns drones, but who controls the software ecosystem behind them. As a research team, the focus of the article rested on, and continues to rest on, the argument that drone sovereignty is increasingly determined by software control rather than the physical ownership of the aircraft. That framing distinguishes this piece from many discussions that focus only on drone strikes, procurement, and battlefield tactics. So for our listeners, we have several big takeaways we'd like to delve into. The first being that Africa is experiencing a drone revolution. Drone warfare is no longer limited to major militaries. State forces, militias, insurgent groups, and terrorist organizations are all using drones. Over the last 2 decades, drone proliferation has become a commonplace tactic within the theater of war and armed conflict, not only on the African continent, but we are seeing it play out globally. In Africa, commercial off-the-shelf drones, which are readily available off-the-rack and non-developmental unmanned aerial vehicles, have been and are being utilized in civilian and military applications and increasingly adopted for asynchronous warfare by non-state actors across the continent. We're seeing examples of drone proliferation, usage, and indigenization in multiple conflicts such as Sudan, Eastern DRC, Mali, Burkina Faso, and the broader Sahel, as well as Libya and Somalia. The barrier to entry collapsed because commercial drones are cheap and widely available. So this brings me to a question for you, Anya. How has drone technology changed the balance of power between states and armed groups?
Yeah, 100%. So initially, one of the biggest changes that drone technology has brought is that it has dramatically lowered barriers to accessing air power. Historically, the ability to control the skies was with the governing bodies in the state who monopolized the airspace. But as this technology has become easier to acquire and the price of acquisition has dropped, we're seeing lowered barriers to access to this technology and therefore the capabilities that it produces. And today, drones have really compressed that capability gap. Governments still maintain an advantage in terms of scale and sophistication because of monetary injections and investment into this technological infrastructure. But non-state armed groups can now access surveillance, intelligence gathering, and as well as strike capabilities that weren't previously available to them using relatively inexpensive intelligence gathering. And so drones haven't necessarily leveled the playing field, but they have definitely changed who can use this technology and participate in the air domain. And Sudan is probably one of the clearest examples of this transformation because it is currently one of Africa's most drone-intensive conflicts, both with the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces integrating drones into their routine military operations. And what is particularly concerning that we've seen is that UNICEF reported 330 children were killed or injured during the first 6 months of 2026. And in North Kordofan, drone attacks accounted for around 60% of child casualties. And so these figures really work to remind us that this isn't simply a story of technological innovation and advancing our software capabilities, but it's really about the human cost behind modern warfare. And so I would like to lead that into Genevieve's explanation as well.
Yes, absolutely. You've highlighted such core aspects of it that is, it's quick for us not to realize when we talk about these unmanned aerial vehicles. I think it's very easy to put yourself away from them as objects that are in the sky or that are remotely controlled. And when we see, as you mentioned with Sudan, seeing that of those deaths, 60% are being attributed to drone attacks, it really highlights the extent of how drone warfare and how its indigenization in African continents has really changed these conflicts and in many ways made them more sustainable. And I think it just brings attention, as you mentioned, is that core to this is just access. Commercial drones, as you've mentioned, they're cheap, they're widely available. And I think that's an integral part into how drone warfare and their usage on the continent is definitely prolonging conflicts, the accessibility by multiple actors. That brings us to another core takeaway that the report highlights is that the most important part of a drone may not be the drone itself. So, most people will think about the airframe, the payload, the camera, but in the article, the argument is that a critical issue is the software. And during our research, and the research phase of the article, it was almost evidently clear to all of us on the team that the role of software was critical and underestimated. And I think as a team, we started asking very specific questions from the get-go. So we were looking at who creates and controls the software, who controls the updates to the software, who issues the licenses, who owns the cloud services, who stores the data, and who can disable this system remotely. And that was central to our thinking, to how we approached this research. It brings up a really important question that I'd like to propose to you, Anya, is can a state really claim drone sovereignty if another country controls the software updates?
Yeah, no, of course. I think it's really crucial that we think of drone sovereignty not just as the physical aircraft, but also as the ecosystem that is encompassing of this drone technology. And that is inclusive of not only the aircraft, the hardware, and the vehicle itself, but also the software authorization that is involved with that, such as the cybersecurity, coding, as well as the different tech stacks that are involved in the operation of these drones. And traditionally, sovereignty was really understood in terms of owning sort of these physical and tangible assets, but this is evolving over time as technology adapts. And, back then, if you owned the aircraft, you controlled a lot of the capability, but modern drone systems are challenging this assumption because aircraft is only one part of the much larger digital ecosystem. And so one thing that is very inclusive of the software is updates and maintenance, and they determine whether certain vulnerabilities are patched, whether new capabilities are added, and whether they even fit your function. Different groups may have different priorities, and whether those updates meet those needs and requirements is very personal to every context that they operate within. And so whoever controls the software and the investment behind it ultimately controls its effectiveness and its usage. And so that's why our article really argues the shift from airframes to algorithms, because the strategic question is not just who owns the drone, who owns the hardware, but who controls the code and the algorithm behind all of it. And so together, those components really determine whether a state has genuine operational independence in their routine military operations, or just remains dependent on the external technological provider. And we've seen this development throughout Africa. While albeit somewhat unevenly, certain countries have really invested in the domestic production, such as Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, Nigeria. We're seeing increased localized production and manufacturing, but it still begs the question of whoever is controlling the software, where does the dependency lay? And so I would like to move that into my question for you, Genevieve. Is Africa building independent drone systems or simply assembling imported technologies?
You highlight so eloquently there that while indigenization is growing on the continent, it's not necessarily evenly. And I think that speaks volumes to whether Africa is building this independent drone ecosystem or whether it's now simply assembling imported technology. And that's crucial to asking the question of how drone sovereignty, how software sovereignty, how drone indigenization is playing out on the continent, because it highlights that building a drone does not mean controlling a drone. And we see certain countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, Morocco, we're seeing investment in local unmanned aerial vehicle productions. So we're seeing drones actively being produced. The technology, the manufacturing, all of these are becoming priorities. They're becoming industries of their own in selected African countries. But I think in some cases you have to ask yourself, when you're manufacturing and you're investing in something, is it really your own product, or are we just, as we've seen across the world, just shifting one drone created in one area to another? And, as you mentioned, there's that back end, there's that other aspect of drones that is easy to overlook. It's not the physical drone itself that's where, as an article we discussed, where the focus is, but rather on the operations of it, on what operates it, how does it operate, who is involved in this software, in this creation of how this object works, how it operates. So I suppose for me, I'm not sure if I'm at a point where I think that we are building independent drone ecosystems on the continent, because the technology we're still using is, while being indigenized and while being applied to the African context, albeit in the context of conflict and war, we are still reliant on, in many ways, the technology that's being produced elsewhere. So it sort of comes into that question of, are we actually creating or developing drones, or are we just the manufacturing plants? And these are all questions that constantly need to be asked, and questions that have impacts on how we regulate and how we navigate and how we decide to approach the policies and the regulations that are going to hopefully be able to somehow control this, to be able to regulate and deal with the repercussions of how easily these drones are being used to perpetuate, sustain, and aggravate conflicts on the continent.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that definitely begs the question of what do you believe is the single biggest misconception policymakers have about drone warfare today?
I think as indigenization progresses, as we've seen, it's not so clear cut. So there's various complexities that arise when we're trying to navigate how to respond. And these are complexities that are facing international organizations, intercontinental countries, state actors. And central to these complexities, as we really try to highlight in the report, is the role of software sovereignty. And it's really the core of what our argument was, as we highlight that there is this shift from the airframe to the algorithm. And I think when it comes to policy, what our policy responses need is, they need to prioritize being sustainable, adaptive, and future focused, because our responses need to be rooted in going beyond the regulation of just the airframes and the munitions. And in the article, we did argue that software sovereignty is a socio-political asset, and it can be used to increase governance, to inform policy, and navigate conflict. So ultimately, perhaps the biggest misconception plaguing policymakers is the emphasis on drone hardware. So when we look at state actors, when we look at organizations like the African Union and its member states, we're seeing that the core issue that needs to be navigated is that control over drone hardware does not equal control over drone capability. And that brings another critical question to ask when it comes to security and when it comes to African security is,
here's something worth your time if you want to keep up with policy and what's driving change. Strategic Insights is Maya's free newsletter for emerging leaders and professionals who want to stay informed about the trends shaping diplomacy, security, and innovation in the Middle East and Africa. Each edition offers clear analysis and practical takeaways to help you cut through the noise and engage more deeply with the issues that matter. Just hit the link in our show notes or find us on LinkedIn at Strategic Insights by Maya. Thanks for tuning in, and now let's return to the conversation.
Anya, how do you see drones, and are they fundamentally changing state sovereignty and how that plays out in Africa?
I would say in certain contexts, yes. Drones are really changing, as I stated before, our traditional understanding of state sovereignty, whereas, historically was viewed as physical assets, physical borders, but because of this changing technology, it's really advancing our understanding of what state sovereignty means and how it's applied. And so drones are sort of transforming all of the areas by allowing states to monitor and influence territory in ways that were previously only possible for much larger military powers because of its renewed accessibility, or sorry, new accessibility. And so for many African states, drone offer a way to overcome longstanding security challenges. And through the production and manufacturing and localization of drones and this technology, states are able to sort of deploy this military capability in a new way. And so a country that maybe previously lacked the resources for larger aerial forces and aerial capacities are able to gain greater visibility over their states, monitor situations and security, perhaps in different forms. And so there is this advancement for states, but there is also the complexity when we shift to the non-state actors who are also gaining this capability, and it definitely influences the security dynamics. And so it definitely challenges the state's traditional monopoly that has been seen historically in the past. And it creates new question about regulatory frameworks, who is providing the software, whether the data is being decentralized, centralized, who is making these decisions. So it creates and poses so many new questions that really must be understood. And we need to sort of veer towards a unified solution to answer these questions, and because they are changing what sovereignty means on the day to day. And it's not just becoming about who controls the airspace and the physical border, but it's about controlling the digital technology and the intelligence systems that really work to enforce this. And who controls that is kind of who controls that resource in that space.
I think, drones, they're not just changing state sovereignty, but they are complicating it. And it's already a complicated situation, and especially in situations and in states that are actively involved in conflicts and civil unrest and civil wars, it's adding another layer of complexity to it. So I think this just brings me to perhaps a more technical question. So for our listeners, a foundational term that's used in drones is a CLA. So that is understood as a control authority layer or layers. So it's part of a layered model in which lower layer authority gates higher combat functions. So those would be your navigation and your payload integration. And these functions explaining why software control can outweigh airframe availability. So with that being said, a little bit more as I say, technological question is, what would you say, with your experience with the research, is the most overlooked control point in the CLA model?
Yes. So I think one thing that is very much overlooked, the first layer is the hardware, and then the second layer is the software. And one thing that is so essential to the operation of both the software and the physical aircraft is the ground control station. And so this is what a GCS, where this comes into play. And the GCS is the drone's brain, and it's the command center. And so without it, missions can't be planned. Operators can't communicate with the drones. You cannot receive and transmit information. So while data could be collected, it may not be communicated in the right way, and therefore it renders your efforts ineffective. And so if this data cannot be analyzed, then we cannot act upon it in the most effective way. And one thing that really goes towards that is who controls the decision making. And this is one thing that we spoke about in our article, is the sensor to shooter loop, because when a drone spots a target, the GCS is able to send information to a command center, and that information can be converted into action. And the faster that this process works, the more effective the force becomes. And so both of these components working in conjunction together really speak to the effectiveness of your technology. And so it's not only about the hardware and the software, it's about the operational authority behind the software, and the GCS is one of the most crucial components in that authority.
As you mentioned, that operational aspect, and that operational authority, which I think is something that also needs to be recognized, the authority when it comes to these drones, it takes me to a point that I'd love to discuss with kill switches. So for our listeners, a kill switch is a mechanism that can disable part or all of a drone system. So in our article, we argue that dependence on foreign software creates vulnerabilities. And I think, as you've highlighted with the CLA, is the discussion that needs to be had is software dependence becoming a new form of geopolitical leverage? Is that what we're seeing play out? Is that what could start playing out?
Yes, I think many countries are using their differing capabilities to exert their power and influence, whether they've had previous investments in technology, or, as we mentioned earlier, with Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, who have this domestic production capability, the ability to control this technology and how it can be customized towards your specific needs. And of course, every political foreign power has differing political needs. And so the ability to maintain and adjust the software to your specific purpose is so critical and so essential, and that can really influence how it is operated with across the globe. And so it is crucial that you are able to sort of be able to work on the adjustments of the system, because you can influence your political biases simply by the production and changing the capabilities of the software. Whereas if you are unable, this can render your technology ineffective, because, as we said, it is the software behind it. And so in stating that, I wanted to ask you, Genevieve, is there a risk that regulation focuses too much on hardware and not enough on the software?
I think that's one of the central questions that also need to be asked. And I think this was a question that policymakers themselves and interested stakeholders and everybody who is watching how drones are evolving and their usage is becoming so commonplace in not just conflicts, but I think just the normal average day to day, how they are becoming a more regular occurrence. And, technology continues to develop and adapt and evolve at an ever increasing pace. Policy and regulations essentially can't keep up with the pace of technological advancement. I think the average person can't keep up with the pace of technological advancement. Something as simple as our cell phones. It's always a new software. There's always a new update. And it's just an advancement at such a pace. And I think regulatory responses, especially to the indigenization of drone warfare in Africa, are developing. They're developing across multiple governance layers. So we are seeing responses at a continental level, seeing them at national and sub-national levels. We're seeing them international levels as well. And currently on the continental level, the African Union provides the principal normative umbrella through the African Peace and Security Architecture, and then also the African Union's master roadmap on silencing the guns. But that being noted, we do not have a binding AU-wide drone control program for the continent. So, as I mentioned earlier, for AU member states, for African countries, the core issue is that control over drone hardware does not equate to control over drone capability. So responding to that core issue, it requires a greater attention on the role of software, something that we've emphasized throughout the article and also throughout this podcast. Regulation risks falling behind if it focuses too much on the hardware and underestimates the software. And it's draws us to the question of whether the current African regulatory frameworks are able to keep pace or are keeping pace with the drone proliferation.
Yeah, so I think one thing you alluded to, Genevieve, is that technology is always fluid and it's continuously and rapidly changing. It's so complex and sophisticated, and these advancements are happening every day at an exponential growth rate. And so currently what we have is that these different layers of governance have different frameworks, but we do not have this AU binding framework that is uniform across all these different organizations. And so a lot of the regulations still concentrate on licensing, the registration of the hardware, airspace safety, all of the preliminary things that are incredibly crucial for the operation of these drones, but some parts tend to fall short on the software applications of those. And so what we need to look forward towards is a standardized and uniform approach to the regulatory environment and how we can adapt to these changes over time, because with the rapid advancement of technology, a lot of our regulatory frameworks can become outdated very quickly if they're not, constantly updated, constantly discussed. And so in order to create this uniform framework, we need, cross collaboratory organization between all of these different governance layers. We need tactical sharing of strategy and ensuring that every layer of this technology is noted, from the technology of the hardware all the way up to the governance of the software. Every aspect of the ecosystem must be looked into and constantly adapt over time.
Absolutely. And as we've discussed technological advancement and the software sovereignty and that adaptability, it leads me to ask a question and a discussion point is, will artificial intelligence, AI, which is becoming a even more commonplace occurrence in our lives, will AI become the next major battleground after software sovereignty?
I think it is possible. And throughout history, we've seen with the advancement of different technologies and different weaponry, the capability at which the different organizations are able to respond to crises and conflicts has changed over time. And so AI is definitely likely to become the next battlefield, because control over artificial intelligence can in the future possibly determine who operates the drones and who makes these decisions. Across all sectors of the world, we are seeing increasingly automated decision making based off AI algorithms, and who controls these algorithms and the decision making processes and frameworks behind it ultimately controls how the the technology operates in that context. And so AI sovereignty goes one step further. It's about controlling the intelligence layer itself. And so for drones, this speaks to the ability to being able to develop and train these algorithms that enable autonomous navigation, target recognition, based in that context, what that means to you, and as well as, intelligence analysis. And so this is where global competition is definitely shifting. A country may have the ability to manufacture a drone, but if it relies on foreign AI models and foreign data sets and its data dependency is decentralized, or even just foreign cloud infrastructure, it remains strategically dependent on that external foreign power. And so I would say that ultimately the next competition is not just simply who owns the drone, but who owns the intelligence that makes the drones effective. And I do believe AI will be an integral component in that. But I would ask you, Genevieve, what would you think on this matter?
Your answer is absolutely spot on. I think we were definitely on the same wavelength there. You so saliently highlighted so many aspects of how artificial intelligence is going to be and can be and would likely be integrated into the technology that plays out when it comes to drones and the software sovereignty, and especially the salient aspect of the foreign owned and the foreign produced AI, and especially looking at its application then on the African continent. And I think when we look at AI and we look at the impact that AI has, we also need to look beyond just the technological aspect of AI and seeing it only as this technological advancement. The same way that as a research team, we look beyond software as just a technological framework, as just something within the confines of, the technological sphere, but we looked at it as a role as a socio-political asset. And AI itself does not exist without that socio-political aspect to it. And that's what also needs to be so saliently focused on. And AI is not just going to be the next battleground in terms of software sovereignty or in terms of the on the ground impacts of AI decision making and usage, but it is the next battleground for policy. And the governance related to that. And, we're seeing software develop at an exponential rate, and AI is far surpassing that. So in terms of being the next battleground, it's going to be a battleground for policymakers. And I think we're going to see that start to play out a lot across international landscapes and not just Africa. And I would like to think that a big part of what this research report has opened our eyes to, I know for myself coming into this research report, not necessarily being the most technologically savvy person, not being able to break down and say, oh, well, a hardware is this and a software is this and a this is this. But having come in with that socio-political lens and that lens of policy analysis, having come in with that and being able to see that we cannot separate drones, we cannot separate their sovereignty in terms of their software sovereignty, and we cannot separate AI from the area of policy and the sphere of politics and the realities of the real world. It's not that easy. We can't leave it in its little technological bubble. We cannot leave the aspects that are associated with to be considered only this one arena, because it's playing out across so many arenas. And I think looking at a case example such as how drone warfare is being indigenized on Africa is a very powerful, a very salient, and a very stark example of how technology is playing out. So I definitely think that AI is our next battleground.
Thank you, Genevieve. And I think, as you said, it's so important to speak not only to this context, but to policy as a whole. And so being able to look at the broader perspective, I think, really creates this holistic understanding. So thank you.
Absolutely. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Anya, for taking the time to have such a fruitful discussion with me about a research paper that I can say proudly we both very much enjoyed working on. It was really an amazing experience to produce this, and now to have the opportunity for us to discuss a lot of it. And, we've only just touched on some of the key takeaways and some of the aspects of what I find is a great, robust report about a very relevant, very timely topic and discussion. So I just want to say thank you so much for taking this time. Thank you for how insightful your answers have been. And I'm 100% sure that our listeners are feeling a lot more informed. And I think we've definitely stirred some more questions and discussion points for them and provided them a bit more insight into the article.
Well, I thank you so much for having me, Genevieve, and for being able to engage in this discussion with you. I really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed writing the research paper and getting into the nitty-gritty details and all the nuances of such a complex environment. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Axis and Arc, a production of the Maya Institute for Strategic Studies. At Maya, we're committed to fresh perspectives and practical insights on diplomacy, security, and innovation across the Middle East and Africa. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow, rate, and share this podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to our Strategic Insights newsletter for more analysis straight to your inbox. You can find all the details and more ways to connect with us in the show notes. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged.